Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Well, greetings, friends, and welcome to this January 1, 2014 edition of Nightcast. You know, it's the first year of the pagan Roman New Year. And for our first story, we're going to Romania, which could well relate to what happens as the EU shapes up this year. I'll tell you more about it after this.
It's icy in Bucharest, but the new year will warm hearts here. From today, Romanians and Bulgarians can work freely in any EU country. Temporary controls have been lifted. Some added festive cheer for Albert Dumitrescu, a security guard keen to leave for the UK.
I want to go to work, to make a better life, and to raise money for my kids, for my family. And after that, I'm coming back. I don't stay there.
But some advice from one who's been and returned, that life in Britain is tougher than it looks.
There might be a slightly romantic view of working and living in Britain. Some people may think of it as an El Dorado of Europe.
Was it an El Dorado for you?
It wasn't an El Dorado for me. It was certainly good, I can't complain, but I did take the decision to come back.
9 EU countries placed restrictions on Romania and Bulgaria, the bloc's poorest members. Now the worry is that some here will migrate to claim social benefits.
Fears in Britain of a mass exodus from here come from a decade ago, when the UK estimated that 15,000 people a year would arrive from Eastern Europe. But in fact, finally, it's thought that 1.5 million actually came. This time, though, it's different. Back then, just 3 countries lifted the restrictions. Now every EU state has its doors open. And many Romanians and Bulgarians who wanted to leave have already done so, since they joined the European Union 7 years ago. At Bucharest Airport, there's no expectation of a rush. Officials here say the story has been overplayed with dangerous rhetoric.
Many politicians in Great Britain use this topic to gain votes. And they go that far that they instigate to xenophobia and racism.
One coach company, though, has tripled its services to London, but others say they don't expect a big increase in demand. I'll go to Britain, he says. It's a better standard of living. Here I can't support my family. I would never leave my country, this woman says. For what? I'm a patriot. Celebrations went long into the night for a new year and new perspectives. Nobody knows how many will leave, but Romanians are just glad to be treated as equals, and that is one cause for a party. Mark Lowen, BBC News, Bucharest.
Thank you, Mark Lowen. And dear friends, the impact of that story is this. Somewhere, at some point in time, Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong, God's apostle for these latter days, said to us that when Romania and Bulgaria got closer to coming into the EU, the EEC, as I think he said it then, watch out. It's going to come together quickly. Now, I can't find a recording on that or a publication on it. And if any of you happen to be aware of that and you have it and you would be kind enough to pass it on to me, I'd be very, very much appreciative, because then I could relate that to others right here and let them know the source. But because of that, I'm really going to be my plan is, God willing, to spend more time on these news stories, and I did that somewhat today, but at the same time now today I also had to switch everything over, middle of dead winter, to a new pagan Roman year called 2014. And I've got all our copyright notices, 2014, and et cetera, so, and that took some time to do. I had to re-record a lot of things and redo a lot of things. It took several hours today. But still, from today, Romanians and Bulgarians, the impact of that story we just heard, Romanians and Bulgarians can work without restrictions across the European Union, across the EU. transitional controls were imposed on the two countries when they joined the EU back in 2007, with member states like Britain only allowing workers in some fields. The lifting of the measures has prompted fears of mass migration from the bloc's poorest countries. And you heard the story with some give and take on that. But we'll be watching that through the year to see what winds up shaping around because of Romania and Bulgaria now having those restrictions lifted and they being a little bit more into the European Union. Friends, just earlier today, a Palestinian diplomat has been killed by an explosion at his home in the Czech capital, Prague. Jamel Jamel, the head of the Palestinian mission, had been taken to hospital after the explosion, but he died of his injuries some 4 hours later. Palestinian officials said the blast happened when Mr. Jamel was moving a safe. You'll see that in this video. You'll hear about that in this video. Czech police say there's no evidence that it was a planned attack. Rob Cameron has the full report on this from the Prague.
Police have been very quick to rule out any indication of foul play, saying that there was no evidence gathered at the scene that this was anything else than an accident. There's certainly no evidence to suggest that this was an attack or an assassination of this senior Palestinian diplomat, the head of the Palestinian mission to the Czech Republic. And indeed, we're getting some very interesting information coming in from the AP news agency, the Palestinian foreign minister, saying that Mr. Al-Jamal, the head of the Palestinian mission, was opening a safe that had been moved from an older building, Palestinian diplomatic building, to a new location in Prague. He was opening that safe inside his residence when the explosion happened. And it seems that this safe, in fact, hadn't been opened for 30 years. It's been lying there in this other location. It moved to a new complex of diplomatic buildings for the Palestinian mission, and Al-Jamal opened that safe shortly before noon on Wednesday today.
So it sounds like a really horrific accident for a diplomat who hasn't been in position very long.
Indeed, he only presented his credentials to the president of the Czech Republic earlier this year in October. He hasn't been in place in his position for very long. And indeed, the embassy or the Palestinian mission to the Czech Republic hasn't even formally opened yet. They've just moved to a newly built location in a leafy suburb of Prague called Suchdol in the north of the Czech capital. It's not even operational yet, and it's already been struck by what appears to be this tragic accident.
And, dear friends, we'll keep an eye on that story. Very interesting. A 30-year-old safe blew up. Somebody must have sabotaged that, put some explosive in that safe a long time ago. Maybe they forgot. Maybe the person that did it long gone and didn't realize who would wind up with the safe. Who knows? That's kind of a mystery story there, but still relates to the Red Horse in a certain way, war and rumors of war, and maybe the Pale Horse mob seditions, just hatred of fellow men, to have an explosive inside of a safe that when someone opens it, the thing blows up. We've got a story next out of North Korea, and we have stories tonight related to the White Horse, the religious deception. We have stories related to the Red Horse and to the Pale Horse. And let's go to this one now from North Korea with Alpa Patel reporting.
The mark of a new year in Pyongyang. But away from the razzmatazz outside, Kim Jong-un gave a fiery and robust message in his New Year's address.
Last year, while we were overflowing with our will to build a strong nation, our party took a firm measure by eliminating factionalist filth within the party. By exposing and purging traitors and counter-revolutionary factionists at the right time and with precision, our party and the spiritual awakening of revolution have firmly solidified, and our strength of unity has been strengthened 100 times more.
He's referring to the execution of his uncle, Jang Song-taek, in December. He was once at the heart of this regime and gave guidance to the young leader. But he was removed for trying to overthrow the state. Kim Jong-un took over from his father 3 years ago after his death. He had represented hope for this secretive regime. Kim Jong-un took over as leader 3 years ago after his father's death. His appointment took the Kim dynasty rule into a third generation. And he has shown that he will do whatever it takes to stay in power. Alpa Patel, News.
Well, friends, wow, what a character that is, eh? Oh, boy. All right, our next story relates to somebody who's in dangerous situation. I mentioned this to you last night and the night before on Michael Schumacher, and I'm kind of following this story for a couple of reasons, one of which, you know, we're instructed in the booklet written by Mr. Herbert Armstrong on the 7 laws of radiant health that one of those laws or rules is to avoid bodily injury. And Mr. Schumacher has taken some risks that have put his life very much in danger.
This is a situation in which Michael Schumacher has been kept stable. He was stable overnight. He's been stable this morning, but the message from them is that he's still in a critical condition overall, and he's certainly not out of any danger. So as we move forward now, it is an hour-by-hour process, it appears, with doctors taking that assessment of Michael Schumacher, wanting to see if he's responding to the second operation that was performed on him earlier this week. That was a 2-hour procedure in total. One other thing that Savine Kem mentioned as well today was the importance of Michael Schumacher's family. They've been here since the very beginning, his wife and children. They've been joined by his brother, and yesterday his father also came to Grenoble. So that family presence, she says, is supporting him. They're with him at the bedside in that intensive care unit, and they, like the many millions of fans that Michael Schumacher retains around the world, are now waiting to hear more progress from the doctors and to see what the long-term prognosis will be for Michael Schumacher.
And friends, that was Richard Conway reporting from Grenoble. And our next story is a story that relates to World War. And because we're now between round 2 and round 3 of World War, as Mr. Armstrong explained it, he said it's not really a new World War coming, it's just a new round of the same war. The UK goes back to round 1 as they make preparations to mark the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. There will be numerous events to mark specific dates in the war, and they will continue for the next 4 years. Well, that's what the lead-in says. Now, they'll continue that if World War III hasn't already begun by then, which it well could. One of the biggest challenges to what the UK is doing, though, will be explaining the sacrifices made by so many to a generation who never met a soldier who served in the battles. In this report, Robert Hall has some interviews with some of those men who did fight in World War I, World War II, and I think these men deserve a lot of honor. The powers that be, God says, are ordained to put evil in check, and that's for our benefit. And because there is a World War, round 3 coming again, World War III, to come up when the beast comes into power. A new emperor is crowned out of Frankfurt, where it's the emperors of the Roman Empire have been crowned in Frankfurt one after another for decades and decades, centuries and centuries, and the next one will very likely, as I've supposed here many times, very likely be another Assyrian emperor, not a Frankish one this time, because the last several have been Assyrian, and the move now is for Assyria to get back in there, and Assyria is the one that usually they get in power, they lead off with World War. Here's Robert Hall with this report.
That bit of land looks got white, it's got some plastic.
Yeah.
So that's where the battle of Passchendaele started, and it took 2 months for them to get from there to where we are now.
On a hilltop near the Belgian town of Passchendaele, an accidental encounter which symbolised the thinking behind 4 years of commemoration. David Cameron, visiting the Commonwealth's largest war cemetery at Tyne Cot, face to face with a group of schoolchildren from Cornwall who were trying to make sense of the 12,000 graves laid out in neat rows around them.
So what do you make of it all? What have you learned today?
Well, we've learned about how many people really did lose their lives, and unfortunately, how many people the body wasn't found, and it's just quite...
And that's what all these names are, I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
Every year, thousands of people make their own pilgrimages to the battlefields, often following an intensely personal trail which ends with one name on a grave or monument. But in Britain, Belgium and France, there's a desire to spark wider involvement in what governments see as a landmark event. In the months since the British government first announced the commemorations, there has been one particular challenge: how to lift events from so long ago out of the pages of our history books and into the lives of as many people as possible. One way of doing that is to provide first-hand experience. Historian Andy Robertshaw has created this section of trenches near his home in Surrey.
I'm a survivor of the Great War. My grandfather, John Andrew Robertshaw, wounded 3 times, served between 1916 and 1919. Everybody who watches a television programme or reads a magazine or a book about the Great War has somebody in their family tree who was involved.
Pack all your troubles in your bowl, keep wagons
Broadcasters, filmmakers, writers, musicians will do all they can to immerse us in those historic and bloody confrontations, but the most powerful message will come from those who were there.
Went we for each other like mad dogs? What was it that we, who had nothing against them personally, fought with them to the very end and death?
I didn't worry about the mud. I didn't hate it anymore. It seemed like a protective blanket covering me. And I thought to myself, well, if this is death, it's not so bad.
We have promised to remember them, but perhaps this anniversary will give us all a fresh understanding of the role so many young men played in shaping the world we know today. Robert Hall, BBC News.
Well, friends of the UK at one time had its hands on the Hong Kong. It surrendered it to a possible independence, except that China is trying to hold some strings on it. Over 10,000 people in Hong Kong have taken to the streets to demand democratic reforms. The Chinese government has agreed to allow the citizens in the semi-autonomous city to directly elect their leaders in 2017. Yet there are worries that Beijing will continue to pull the strings from behind the scenes. Juliana Liu reports from Hong Kong.
Hong Kong residents are rallying to demand the right to choose their own leader. After years of delays, the Chinese government has finally agreed to allow universal suffrage. But many residents fear Beijing will use its power and influence to filter out candidates it deems unacceptable, in doing so robbing voters of a free and fair election.
If we don't come up this day, we will lose a battle which will encourage the pro-government parties or supporters of the government to say that Hong Kong people do not need a real democracy.
So what exactly is real democracy? This citywide civil referendum aims to find out.
To get a sense of what Hong Kong's 3.5 million eligible voters want to achieve in terms of political reforms, pro-democracy activists have organized this ballot box exercise where residents can have their say on a series of 3 questions, including whether the public should get to nominate their next chief executive.
Its organizers are also the men behind a civil disobedience campaign called Occupy Central to oppose what they think might be a sham election.
This is a way to allow Hong Kong citizens to familiarize with the whole arrangement, and that so that in June we can come up with a proposal that we can put forward to the government for them to consider. And in case if the government accept our proposal, actually there's no need for further civil disobedience acts.
The protesters believe a chief executive loyal to Beijing will not respect the freedom of speech, human rights and the rule of law. And they're determined not to allow such a person to assume leadership. Juliana Liu, BBC News, Hong Kong.
And friends, in the United States, next door to the United States, in Mexico, there's, that story though, before we move to the story on Mexico, they ask in that story, what exactly is democracy? I think that's maybe, perhaps especially today, what some of us in the United States might like to know. What exactly is democracy? If we have time tonight, I may be able to get to a story that relates to the many, many different aspects of Obamacare that roll into play today, January 1, 2014. But in this story next, on New Year's Day in 1994, Mexico woke up to a shock in key cities and towns across the southern state of Chiapas, a little-known indigenous rebel group called the EZLN, or the Zapatistas, had emerged from the jungle to declare war on the Mexican state. In the space of a few hours on the same day, the North American Free Trade Agreement came into force. The group had taken control of much of the region. There followed several days of sustained fighting until the army restored order. But as Will Grant reports from Chiapas, the group continues to push for greater recognition of the new rights in what is one of the protest regions of Mexico.
Today, San Cristobal is one of Mexico's most prized tourist destinations. But on New Year's Day 1994, people awoke to a battleground. An unknown indigenous rebel group called the Zapatistas had emerged from the jungle to declare war on the Mexican state. Mexico was caught off guard. By the time the government reacted, the group had taken over much of Chiapas. On that January morning, Concepcion Villafuerte was a journalist at El Tiempo. She was among the first to meet the Zapatistas' shadowy and charismatic leader, Subcomandante Marcos, and published their demands.
The first 6 demands were very basic: land, a home, food, health, education and work. The others were more general: justice, democracy and freedom. They were basic needs for everyone, for all poor people, not just Indians.
Today, the Zapatistas' struggle has been reduced to a handful of municipalities like Oventic. Known as caracoles, these self-sufficient communities have their own healthcare, education and agricultural systems and are not recognized by the government. They ask the state for nothing and receive nothing in return. We were given rare and exclusive access to Oventic, but under strict conditions. Little wonder they are wary of strangers. This is the village of Actial, where locals sympathized with the Zapatistas but rejected their use of violence. But in 1997, paramilitaries stormed the village and massacred 45 people, including babies and pregnant women.
And friends, Will Grant, also in Chiapas, has another story that relates to the White Horse, this time that shows something very interesting. Catholic churches in southern Mexico can use the local Mayan languages for church services now. according to Pope Francis. He's allowed them to do this. More than 60% of San Cristobal de las Casas churchgoers are indigenous and have spent many years attending Mass in languages they did not fully understand, first in Latin, then in Spanish. The decision is being seen as part of the Pope's effort to reform traditional elements of the Vatican and bring it closer to ordinary Catholics. Here's Will Grant again from the state of Chiapas with this story.
Confirmation is an important moment in the life of any devoted Catholic. It marks the moment in which they make for themselves the promises and commitments to God which were made on their behalf when they were baptized. But in the Templo La Caridad in San Cristobal de las Casas, the ceremony is particularly special. It's being held in Tzotzil, the main indigenous language spoken in this part of Mexico, after the Vatican recently approved its use in the liturgy. After 7 years of petitioning and decades of translation of the Bible into local Mayan tongues, Pope Francis has given the green light for Tzotzil to be used in weekly Mass, as well as in traditional Catholic rites such as baptism, First Holy Communion and confession. Another Mayan language, Celtal, was also approved. Local Bishop Enrique Diaz, who has learnt Tzotzil himself, says the recognition from the Vatican has been a long time in coming. In part, he credits Pope Francis for turning his attention towards his native Latin America.
Undoubtedly, Pope Francis has brought a fresh approach to this, as someone who is closer in terms of both Latin American thinking and indigenous peoples. Even though there isn't such an indigenous presence in Argentina, he's spent time with indigenous communities and understands us more.
Okay, friends, we're going to move on now to a story related to the United States and what happens today. From today, millions of Americans will receive health care coverage for the first time as President Obama's reforms come into effect. However, the law has been controversial and its rolling out was dogged with problems. Rajini Vadyanathan has a report on Obamacare happening today.
Healthcare system in the US. Instead, people here buy insurance to pay for their medical bills. But millions of Americans don't have any kind of cover, and that's something President Obama wants to change with the introduction of his healthcare law. The law, the Affordable Care Act, is also known as Obamacare. Under the legislation, if you don't have health insurance, you'll face a fine. Those who can't afford it will get assistance. Businesses of a certain size will be expected to provide cover for their staff, and insurers can no longer refuse cover for people with pre-existing medical conditions. The changes to the law are controversial. Many politicians here at the US Capitol argue that making employers take out healthcare insurance for their staff will cost small businesses and the economy as a whole. And many people across America also have a fundamental objection, arguing that by making healthcare insurance compulsory, it effectively amounts to unnecessary intervention by the state.
All right, friends, and I don't want to get the pagan Roman New Year off to too bad of a start for you, so we'll just leave that story at the fact that all this stuff with Obamacare starts to begin off today. I'd like to show you just a little bit of, in the background here, a little bit of the fireworks have been revised by the reporting of the BBC. They've got some more cities than we had that we showed you last night to start off the pagan Roman year of 2014 in a grandiose way. And as that plays in the background, I'm going to say thank you for joining me tonight, dear friends, and God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again. This is Wednesday night. We'll be back again Thursday night with more of the current day's news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. Until next time, this is your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.
Start spreading the news.